It was late November when my wife, Emily, her friend, Megan, and I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods for a weekend getaway. We lived in Portland, Oregon, and figured a break from the city noise would be refreshing. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere, near the base of Mount Hood. The pictures online showed a cozy wooden house surrounded by towering pines, with a small clearing out front and a fire pit. It seemed perfect for some peace and quiet. We packed our things Friday morning and made the 2-hour drive out there. The drive was scenic, with winding roads and dense forest stretching on both sides. Emily and Megan talked about how excited they were to relax, make s'mores, and enjoy the crisp mountain air. I focused on the road, occasionally glancing at the GPS to ensure we were on track. As we got closer, the paved roads turned to gravel, and soon enough, the gravel gave way to dirt. By the time we reached the cabin, there were no signs of civilization for miles. The cabin looked just like the photos, small but inviting. It had a single story with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked under our feet. There was no cell signal, but we knew that going in. The idea was to disconnect for the weekend, and that's exactly what we planned to do. We unloaded the car and carried our bags inside. The cabin was simple: 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, and a living area with a wood-burning stove. There were no TVs or Wi-Fi, just a stack of board games and a couple of old books on a shelf. It was cozy, but something about the stillness outside felt off. I chalked it up to being unused to the quiet after living in the city for so long. By the time we settled in, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing in front of the cabin. We built a fire outside and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and talking. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen them, and the air was cold but refreshing. Despite my earlier unease, it was shaping up to be a good night. That changed when we heard the sound. It was faint at first, like something moving through the woods. I thought it might be an animal, a deer or maybe a raccoon, but then it grew louder, closer. It wasn't just one sound either. It was multiple, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. Emily and Megan noticed it too. We all fell silent, straining to hear. I grabbed a flashlight from the porch and shone it toward the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but dense forest. The sounds stopped, as if whatever was out there knew we were watching. After a few tense moments, I turned off the flashlight and told myself it was probably just animals. We decided to head inside for the night. The first strange thing happened around midnight. I was in bed with Emily when I heard a thud outside. It wasn't loud, but it was distinct enough to wake me up. I listened closely, my heart pounding in the silence. Another thud, followed by what sounded like something being dragged across the porch. I got out of bed as quietly as I could and peeked through the window. The porch was empty, but the fire pit outside had been disturbed. The chairs we'd left around it were overturned, and the ashes from the fire were scattered across the clearing. I didn't want to alarm Emily or Megan, so I decided to check it out in the morning. I locked the front door, double-checked the windows, and went back to bed. Sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I went outside to inspect the area. The fire pit was as I'd seen it the night before. Chairs overturned and ashes blown around. But what caught my attention were the footprints. They weren't animal tracks. They were human, barefoot, and they circled the cabin. My stomach turned as I followed them around the house. Whoever had been out there had walked right up to the windows and back down to the fire pit. The prints led into the woods and disappeared. I didn't tell Emily or Megan about the footprints. I didn't want to ruin the trip, and honestly, I wasn't sure what to make of it myself. Maybe some local kids had come by to mess with us. I decided to keep an eye out and let it go for now. The day passed uneventfully. We hiked a nearby trail, took pictures of the scenery, and played board games when we got back to the cabin. By evening, we'd almost forgotten about the strange noises and the footprints. We built another fire, but this time, I stayed on edge, my eyes scanning the tree line every few minutes. It wasn't until the second night that things escalated. We were inside playing cards when the power went out. The lights flickered once and then died, plunging the cabin into darkness. Megan let out a nervous laugh, saying it was probably just a blown fuse. I grabbed a flashlight and went to check the breaker box outside. As soon as I stepped onto the porch, I felt it, that sensation of being watched. The woods were pitch black, the kind of dark where you can't see your hand in front of your face. I scanned the tree line with the flashlight, half expecting to see someone standing there. But there was nothing, just the rustling of leaves in the wind. The breaker box was on the side of the cabin. I opened it and found that all the switches were flipped. I reset them, but the power didn't come back on. That's when I heard the sound again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from behind me. I whipped around, shining the flashlight wildly, but there was no one there. My heart was racing as I hurried back inside, locking the door behind me. We decided to call it a night and went to bed early. Emily and Megan were clearly spooked, though we didn't talk about it. I lay awake for hours, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. At some point, I must have drifted off because I woke up to the sound of Megan screaming. I bolted out of bed and ran to her room. She was standing in the corner, pointing at the window. The glass was smeared with something dark, mud or maybe blood, and there were handprints, large and uneven, pressed against it. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it outside, but once again, there was nothing. No movement, no sound, just the eerie stillness of the woods. We decided to leave first thing in the morning. None of us slept the rest of the night. We stayed in the living room, huddled together with the flashlight and a kitchen knife I'd found in a drawer. Every so often, I thought I heard something outside, a branch snapping or leaves crunching, but I convinced myself it was just my imagination. When dawn finally came, we packed our things as quickly as we could and loaded them into the car. As I started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees. It was tall and thin, wearing what looked like tattered clothes. I couldn't make out its face, but it was watching us. I slammed the car into reverse and sped down the dirt road, not stopping until we were miles away. We never reported what happened. Who would believe us? Even now, months later, I can't explain what we saw or heard. But every so often, I think about those footprints circling the cabin and the figure in the woods, and I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed another night. I had just turned 24 when I was invited to a cabin deep in the woods by my dad's old friend, Sergeant Mike. He was a retired officer, the kind of man who carried himself with authority even after leaving the force. I had met him a few times as a kid, but those encounters were fleeting. He always seemed larger than life, a man full of stories about discipline and survival. My dad thought it would be good for me to spend a few days with him, get some real-world wisdom, as he called it. I didn't argue. I needed a break from the monotony of my office job. The cabin was about 5 hours north of where I lived in Michigan, near the edge of Huron National Forest. It wasn't a fancy setup, just a small, weathered structure that looked like it had been built decades ago. It stood isolated, surrounded by towering pines and dense underbrush. The nearest town was at least an hour away, and cell phone service was non-existent. That was part of the charm, though. I wanted to disconnect, and this seemed like the perfect opportunity. When I arrived, Mike greeted me with a firm handshake and a nod. He hadn't changed much, still tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair cut short, and his eyes sharp and observant. He was the type of man who didn't waste words. After showing me around the cabin and explaining the basics, where the water pump was, how to use the wood stove, he handed me a rifle. For the coyotes, he said matter-of-factly. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was a precautionary measure. Coyotes weren't uncommon in these parts, and I wasn't exactly experienced with wildlife. The first day was uneventful. We spent most of it chopping wood, cleaning the cabin, and setting up for the week. Mike had a methodical way of doing things, and I followed his lead. By the time the sun set, the cabin was warm and cozy. We ate a simple dinner of canned chili and bread, and then he told me about his time in the military. His stories were fascinating, full of danger and camaraderie, but he always kept them grounded in reality. There was no bravado, just raw honesty. I respected that. That night, as I lay on the lumpy cot in the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The woods were eerily quiet. No rustling leaves, no distant howls, just an oppressive silence. I chalked it up to my unfamiliarity with the environment and eventually fell asleep. The second day, Mike suggested we hike deeper into the woods to check the hunting traps he had set up earlier in the season. It sounded like a good way to explore the area, so I agreed. We left just after sunrise, each carrying a small pack with supplies. The trails were faint, more like game paths than anything designed for human use. Mike moved with confidence, his rifle slung over his shoulder, while I stumbled over roots and struggled to keep up. About an hour into the hike, we came across the first trap. It was empty, but Mike examined it carefully, checking for signs of recent activity. "Something's been through here," he muttered, more to himself than to me. I didn't ask what he meant. He didn't seem like the type to appreciate unnecessary questions. As we moved deeper into the forest, the trees grew denser, their branches intertwining overhead to create a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air felt heavier, and the silence from the night before returned. It was unsettling. Even Mike seemed more alert, his eyes scanning the surroundings as we walked. We found the second trap around noon. It had been triggered, but whatever had been caught was gone. The metal jaws were bent out of shape, as if something incredibly strong had forced them open. Mike frowned, crouching down to inspect the trap. "Bear?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe," he replied, but he didn't sound convinced. We continued on, checking 2 more traps, both of which were in similar condition, triggered but empty with signs of damage. By the time we turned back toward the cabin, the sun was dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The unease I'd felt earlier had only grown stronger. It wasn't just the silence or the damaged traps. It was the sense that we were being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the trees, but there was nothing. That night, as we sat by the wood stove, Mike seemed unusually quiet. He was normally calm and composed, but now he looked tense, his jaw set and his eyes darting toward the windows every few minutes. I finally worked up the nerve to ask if he thought there was a bear nearby. "Could be," he said after a long pause. "But bears don't usually mess with traps like that. Whatever's out there, it's smart." I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me sit up and listen. Around 3 a.m., I heard something outside, heavy footsteps, deliberate and slow, crunching through the underbrush. I froze, holding my breath as the footsteps grew louder. They circled the cabin, pausing near the windows before moving on. I wanted to wake Mike, but I was too scared to move. The steps eventually faded into the distance, but I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, Mike didn't say much. He handed me a cup of coffee and told me to stay close to the cabin while he went out to check the perimeter. I didn't argue. I spent the day chopping wood and keeping the fire going, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread. When Mike returned, he looked grim. "Found tracks," he said. "Big ones. Not a bear." That was all he said, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I wanted to ask what he thought it was, but I was afraid of the answer. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were accompanied by a low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the walls of the cabin. Mike grabbed his rifle and motioned for me to stay quiet. We sat in the dark, listening as the sounds moved around the cabin. Whatever it was bold, almost taunting us. The growling stopped suddenly, and for a moment, there was silence. Then something slammed against the cabin wall, hard enough to make the entire structure shake. Mike cursed under his breath, aiming his rifle at the door. I gripped the axe I'd been using to chop wood earlier, my hands slick with sweat. The slamming continued, each hit more forceful than the last. I could see the door frame starting to splinter, and I thought for sure it was going to break. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours, but the creature didn't return. When dawn finally broke, Mike decided it was time to leave. "We're not staying another night here," he said firmly. I didn't argue. We packed our things quickly, leaving behind anything that wasn't essential. As we made our way back to my car, the sense of being watched never left. I kept expecting to see something emerge from the trees, but the forest remained eerily still. We didn't talk much during the drive back to civilization. Mike's face was pale, his usual composure replaced by a look of quiet fear. When we finally reached the highway, he turned to me and said, "Don't tell your dad about this. He'll think we're crazy." I nodded, but I knew I'd never forget what happened. To this day, I don't know what was out there in the woods, but I've never felt fear like that before or since. Whatever it wasn't just an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong, and it wanted us to know we were trespassing. It was late October when my fiancée, Rachel, and I decided to head out to a remote cabin for the weekend. Her stepbrother, Liam, had joined us on a whim. I wasn't thrilled about it. The trip was supposed to be a getaway for just the two of us, but Rachel had insisted. She said Liam needed some time away from the city, and I reluctantly agreed. The cabin belonged to Rachel's family, a modest wooden structure tucked deep in the forests of Vermont, far from the nearest town. The three of us arrived late on Friday evening. The drive had been long and tedious, the narrow, winding roads slick with recent rain. The cabin itself was just as I'd imagined, rustic and isolated, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions. The air was sharp with the scent of pine, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. There was a small living room with a wood-burning stove, a kitchenette, and 2 bedrooms. Rachel and I took the larger room, while Liam claimed the smaller one. After unloading our bags and settling in, we spent the evening playing cards and sipping hot chocolate. The vibe was relaxed, but I couldn't shake a faint unease. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was Liam's presence. He was polite enough, but there was something about him I couldn't quite put my finger on. A certain intensity in his eyes, a quietness that felt calculated. The next morning, Rachel suggested we go hiking. The woods were beautiful, she said, and the weather was perfect. Liam seemed eager, so I agreed, though I wasn't much of a hiker. We packed some snacks and water, put on our boots, and headed out. The trail Rachel led us on was narrow and overgrown, snaking its way through thick underbrush. The air was crisp, and sunlight filtered through the canopy above, dappling the ground in patches of gold. As we walked, Rachel chatted about her childhood memories of the cabin, pointing out landmarks along the way. A moss-covered boulder she used to climb, a hollow tree she and Liam had used as a hideout. Liam, for the most part, stayed quiet, his eyes scanning the surroundings. I brought up the rear, feeling like an outsider in their shared nostalgia. About an hour into the hike, we came across a small clearing. There was an old fire pit in the center, surrounded by a few makeshift benches. Rachel suggested we take a break, so we sat down and had some water. As we rested, I noticed Liam staring at something in the distance. When I followed his gaze, I saw what looked like a dilapidated shack partially hidden by the trees. It was small, no larger than a garden shed, and looked like it had been abandoned for years. "What's that?" I asked, more to myself than anyone else. Neither Rachel nor Liam responded, but I could tell they had noticed it too. After a moment, Rachel stood up and dusted off her pants. "Let's keep going," she said, her tone a little too casual. Something about her sudden eagerness to leave made me uneasy, but I didn't press the issue. We continued hiking for another hour before turning back. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sun was beginning to set. Rachel suggested we make dinner, so she and I worked together in the kitchen while Liam chopped firewood outside. The evening passed uneventfully, but that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the shack. Something about it bothered me, though I couldn't say why. The next day, Rachel said she wanted to spend the morning sketching by the lake nearby. She loved to draw, and the lake was one of her favorite spots. Liam said he wasn't interested, so Rachel went alone while Liam and I stayed behind. I decided to use the time to read, but Liam seemed restless. He kept pacing around the cabin, glancing out the windows as if expecting to see something. After a while, he came into the living room where I was sitting. "I'm going for a walk," he said abruptly. I nodded, not really paying attention, and he left without another word. I watched him disappear into the woods, heading in the direction of the shack. The unease I'd felt the day before returned, stronger this time. An hour passed, then two. Rachel came back from the lake, her sketch pad under one arm and a contented smile on her face. "Where's Liam?" she asked. I told her he'd gone for a walk, and her smile faded. "By himself?" she asked, her tone sharp. I nodded, and she frowned but didn't say anything. By late afternoon, Liam still hadn't returned. Rachel was worried, but I tried to reassure her. "He probably just lost track of time," I said. "He'll be back soon." But as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness crept in, I began to worry too. Rachel wanted to go look for him, but I convinced her to wait a little longer. "Let's give him until 9, I said. "If he's not back by then, we'll go." She reluctantly agreed, though she kept pacing by the window, peering out into the night. 9 o'clock came and went, and there was still no sign of Liam. We grabbed flashlights and set out, following the path he'd taken earlier. The woods were eerily silent. The only sounds the crunch of leaves under our boots and the occasional snap of a twig. We called his name, our voices swallowed by the darkness. Eventually, we reached the clearing with the fire pit. Rachel stopped abruptly, shining her flashlight toward the shack. The door was ajar, swinging slightly in the breeze. My stomach tightened. "Let's check it out," I said, though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The shack was even smaller up close, its walls warped and covered in moss. Inside, it was dark and smelled of damp wood and decay. We found Liam lying on the floor, unconscious but breathing. His clothes were torn, and his face was scratched, as if he'd been in a fight. Rachel dropped to her knees beside him, shaking him gently. He stirred, his eyes fluttering open, but he didn't seem to recognize us at first. We managed to get him back to the cabin, where he finally started to come around. He was disoriented and couldn't explain what had happened. "I don't remember," he kept saying. "I don't remember." That night, none of us slept. Liam sat by the fire, staring into the flames, while Rachel and I stayed close by. The next morning, we packed our things and left. None of us spoke much on the drive back to the city, but the unease lingered. Weeks later, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I started researching the area around the cabin, looking for any information about the shack. What I found chilled me to the bone. Decades ago, a man had been found dead in the woods near the cabin. He was a drifter, a recluse who had lived in a shack deep in the forest. Locals said he was odd, prone to violent outbursts, and he disappeared under mysterious circumstances. To this day, I don't know what happened to Liam in that shack. He refuses to talk about it, and Rachel avoids the subject altogether. But sometimes, late at night, I think about the look in Liam's eyes when we found him. Wild, terrified, as if he'd seen something no one was meant to see. And I wonder if whatever it was is still out there, waiting. It was the summer of 2016, and I was 27 years old when I decided to spend a week at a cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota. I'd been feeling burned out from work and thought the isolation would help clear my head. I wasn't much of an outdoorsy person, but something about disconnecting completely appealed to me. I wanted quiet, just the sound of wind rustling through trees and the chirping of birds. I found the cabin on a rental site. It was cheap, a little run down, but in a perfect location. Miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest, and sitting on the edge of a small, still lake. The description promised complete seclusion, and when I drove the long dirt road leading to the cabin, I realized they weren't exaggerating. It felt like I'd left civilization behind entirely. When I arrived, the place was even more isolated than I'd imagined. The cabin was small and basic, just a single room with a bed, a kitchenette, and a tiny bathroom. There was no Wi-Fi or cell service, and the electricity came from a noisy generator that sat behind the cabin. A stack of firewood was piled by the door, and a canoe was tied up by the lake's edge. It was rustic, sure, but I liked it. I could already feel the stress from work lifting. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time reading, paddling the canoe around the lake, and sitting on the porch, staring out at the water. The silence was so complete that I started to notice every little sound. A bird landing on the roof, the wind shifting through the trees, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. At first, it was calming, but by the second night, I started to feel on edge. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to a sound I couldn't place. It wasn't loud, but in the total quiet of the forest, it stood out. It was coming from outside the cabin, a faint rustling, like someone walking through the underbrush. I sat up in bed, listening closely, trying to convince myself it was just an animal. After a few minutes, the sound stopped, and I eventually fell back asleep. The next morning, I looked around the area near the cabin. I didn't see anything unusual. No tracks, no signs that anyone or anything had been there. I told myself it must have been a deer or some other animal and tried to shake off the unease. But I couldn't ignore how vulnerable I felt. Out here, no one would hear me if something went wrong. That evening, as the sun dipped below the treetops, I felt the isolation more acutely. The woods around the cabin seemed darker and more oppressive. I locked the door and windows before climbing into bed, but it didn't make me feel any safer. I woke up again that night, this time to the sound of something tapping against the side of the cabin. It was slow and deliberate, like someone knocking lightly but persistently. My heart started pounding as I lay there, frozen, listening. The tapping stopped, and then I heard soft footsteps moving away from the cabin. I wanted to convince myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. Animals don't tap on walls. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it some local messing with me? A hunter who didn't realize someone was staying here? Or worse, someone who did know I was here? The next morning, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. In the dirt outside the cabin, there were footprints, human footprints. They were faint, but they were there, leading from the woods to the side of the cabin and then back toward the trees. I couldn't tell how old they were, but they hadn't been there the day before. I decided to stay close to the cabin that day. I didn't feel comfortable wandering far, not knowing who or what might be out there. I kept a hatchet from the firewood pile within arm's reach, even though I didn't really know how to use it as a weapon. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the soft footsteps outside, circling the cabin. They were slow and deliberate, almost like whoever it was wanted me to hear them. I lay there, gripping the hatchet, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped for a while, and I started to think maybe they were gone. But then came the sound of the doorknob rattling. I nearly screamed but managed to stay silent. The door was locked, but I knew it wouldn't take much to force it open. I held my breath, waiting, but the rattling stopped after a few seconds. Then I heard the footsteps again, retreating into the woods. When the sun finally came up, I made the decision to leave. I didn't care if I'd only been there a few days. I wasn't sticking around to see what would happen next. I packed my things in a hurry, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone watching me from the trees. As I loaded my car, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, right by the door, was a small pile of rocks. I hadn't put them there, and they definitely hadn't been there the day before. It felt like some kind of message, but I didn't want to think about what it meant. I just wanted to get out of there. Driving back down the dirt road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. When I finally reached the main road and saw other cars for the first time in days, I almost cried with relief. I never found out who or what was outside that cabin. I reported it to the rental company, but they didn't seem particularly concerned. They said they'd look into it, but I never heard back. I still think about it sometimes late at night when the house is quiet and I can't sleep. I think about those footsteps, the tapping on the wall, and the pile of rocks on the porch. And I wonder if whoever or whatever was out there that week is still out there, waiting for the next person to rent that cabin. When I was 25, I decided to take a break from city life and spend a few weeks at my grandma's old cabin in the middle of the woods in northern Maine. The cabin had been in the family for decades, and I hadn't been there since I was a kid. I remembered it as a cozy place with creaky floors, a stone fireplace, and a slightly musty smell that never went away no matter how much you cleaned. My grandma passed away the previous year, and the cabin had been left untouched since. No one else in the family seemed interested in it. My mom suggested selling it, but I wasn't ready to let it go. Something about the place felt like it still held pieces of my childhood, and I wanted to see it one more time before deciding what to do with it. The cabin was a 4-hour drive from where I lived in Portland. The further I drove, the more isolated the landscape became. Pine trees lined the narrow roads, their dense branches blocking out most of the sky. Cell service dropped about an hour before I arrived, leaving me alone with nothing but the hum of my car engine and the occasional bird flitting across the road. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I realized just how long it had been since anyone had taken care of the place. The wooden siding was weathered and gray, and patches of moss had taken over the roof. The yard was overgrown, with tall grass brushing against my knees as I walked to the front door. I unlocked the door with the old key my mom had mailed me, and the familiar scent of aged wood and mildew hit me immediately. The inside was exactly as I remembered. Same plaid couch, same worn rugs, same kitchen table with a missing corner. It was like stepping back in time. After unloading my bags, I spent the afternoon cleaning. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs hung in the corners like forgotten decorations. By the time the sun started setting, the place felt somewhat livable again. I made a quick dinner of canned soup, ate by the fireplace, and then settled in for the night. The first night was uneventful, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't unusual for me to feel uneasy in a new place, but this was different. The silence of the woods pressed in on me, broken only by the occasional creak of the cabin settling or the distant hoot of an owl. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the windows and decided to explore the surrounding area. The cabin sat on a few acres of land, most of it thick forest. I grabbed a map my grandma had kept in the cabin and headed out, hoping to reacquaint myself with the trails I used to wander as a kid. The woods were dense and quiet, the kind of quiet that made you constantly aware of your own breathing and footsteps. About an hour in, I found an old trail that seemed familiar, though it was almost completely overgrown. I pushed through the brush, ducking under low branches and stepping over fallen logs. Eventually, I came to a small clearing where an old shed stood, its roof sagging and the wood rotting in places. I didn't remember this shed. It looked abandoned, like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curious, I stepped closer. The door was slightly ajar, and I hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, I found a mess of rusted tools, broken crates, and a few animal bones scattered on the dirt floor. The air inside was stale and heavy, and something about the place made me feel uneasy. I left quickly and made my way back to the cabin, but the unease stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. The wind rattling the windows, the branches scraping against the roof, the distant howl of some animal. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside. I froze, listening intently. The sound was faint but distinct, like someone walking through the tall grass. My heart pounded as I grabbed the flashlight I'd left on the nightstand and crept to the window. I shone the light outside but saw nothing. The footsteps stopped, and the silence felt heavier than ever. I told myself it was just a deer or some other animal and went back to bed, though I barely slept. The following day, I tried to shake off the fear. I spent the morning chopping wood and cleaning out the fireplace, trying to keep busy. In the afternoon, I ventured back into the woods, this time avoiding the trail to the shed. I found a small stream and followed it for a while, enjoying the sound of the running water. As I was heading back, I noticed something odd, boot prints in the mud along the stream. They weren't mine. They were larger and deeper, like someone heavier had walked through recently. I felt a chill run down my spine. I followed the prints for a short distance before they veered off into the woods. I debated whether to keep following them, but decided against it. Instead, I hurried back to the cabin, locking the door behind me as soon as I got inside. That night, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, closer. I turned off all the lights and peered out the window, scanning the yard with my flashlight. Again, I saw nothing, but as I was about to turn away, I thought I caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the woods, a shadow slipping behind a tree. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching a kitchen knife and jumping at every sound. When morning came, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my bags and loaded them into the car, determined to leave as soon as possible. But as I was locking up the cabin, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the porch, just outside the front door, was a single muddy boot print. I didn't wait around to find out who it belonged to. I got in my car and drove away, not stopping until I was miles from the cabin. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I never went back to the cabin, and we eventually sold it to a stranger. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that shadow in the woods and wonder if it's still out there watching. I was looking for a break from the noise of the city. Life had been hectic, and I thought a week alone in the woods would help me reset. I found an old cabin for rent online, The photos showed a simple structure: wooden walls, a stone chimney, and a small porch. It wasn't luxurious, but it looked cozy. The cabin was in northern Minnesota, near a lake, surrounded by dense forest. The ad claimed it was secluded and peaceful, which was exactly what I wanted. I booked it without a second thought. It was late October 2022 when I drove out there. The air had that crispness of fall, the kind that smells faintly of damp leaves and the promise of winter. The road narrowed as I got closer, the trees on either side closing in like a tunnel. My GPS struggled to keep up as I turned onto a dirt path that seemed to go on forever. After about 20 minutes, the cabin appeared, tucked away in a clearing. It looked exactly like the photos, small, simple, and inviting. There was no cell service, which I'd expected. I had brought a stack of books, a journal, and enough food to last the week. The cabin had a generator, but the owner had warned me to use it sparingly. Most of the lighting came from battery-powered lanterns, and there was a wood-burning stove for heat. It was rustic, but I liked that. The first day was uneventful. I unpacked, explored the area a little, and settled in. The silence was jarring at first. No hum of traffic, no distant chatter. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, I lit a fire in the stove, read for a while, and went to bed early. The bed was firm but comfortable, and I fell asleep quickly. The second day was colder. The sky was overcast, and the wind had picked up. I decided to take a hike down to the lake. It was only about half a mile from the cabin, through a narrow trail that wound between the trees. The lake was beautiful, calm, with water so clear you could see the rocks at the bottom near the shore. I spent an hour sitting on a large boulder, just watching the water ripple in the wind. As I walked back, I noticed something strange. About halfway to the cabin, I saw a pile of rocks on the side of the trail. They were stacked neatly, like a small cairn. I hadn't noticed it on my way down, but I figured I must have missed it. Still, something about it made me uneasy. It felt out of place, like it didn't belong there. That night, the wind howled around the cabin. It rattled the windows and made the trees groan. I heard branches snapping somewhere in the distance. I told myself it was just the weather, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing at the windows, half expecting to see a face staring back at me. Of course, there was nothing. The third day was when things started to get worse. I decided to explore further into the woods. I packed a small bag with water and snacks and set out around mid-morning. The forest was dense, and the trails weren't well marked. I tried to keep track of my path, but it was easy to get turned around. After about an hour, I stumbled onto a clearing. In the center was an old fire pit, surrounded by logs that had been arranged as makeshift seats. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. The logs were rotting, and the fire pit was overgrown with weeds. Still, there was something unsettling about it. I felt like I shouldn't be there, like I was intruding. I turned to leave and froze. On the far side of the clearing, partially hidden by the trees, was another pile of rocks. This one was bigger, about waist-high, and less neatly stacked. The rocks were covered in moss, and some of them looked like they had been scratched or chipped. I didn't stay to investigate. I walked back to the cabin as quickly as I could without breaking into a run. The whole way, I felt like I was being followed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but I didn't see anything. By the time I got back, I was out of breath and my hands were shaking. I locked the door and double-checked all the windows. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something outside. Footsteps crunching on the gravel, faint whispers carried on the wind. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the fear. Around midnight, the power went out. The cabin went completely dark, and the silence was deafening. I fumbled for my flashlight and sat on the bed, clutching it like a lifeline. The fourth day, I decided to leave. I packed my things and loaded them into the car, but when I turned the key, the engine wouldn't start. I tried again and again, but it just clicked. The battery was dead. I cursed myself for not checking it earlier. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was over 10 miles away. I was stuck. I spent the rest of the day trying to stay calm. I rationed my food and water, not knowing how long I'd be there. That night, the noises outside got louder. I heard something scratching at the walls, followed by a low, guttural sound that I couldn't identify. I stayed awake all night, holding a kitchen knife and praying for the sun to rise. By the 5th day, I was desperate. I decided to hike to the nearest road and try to flag down a car. I left a note in the cabin explaining what had happened and set out early in the morning. The forest felt different that day, darker, quieter. The usual sounds of birds and insects were gone. Every step I took seemed to echo. After about an hour, I realized I was lost. The trail I had been following disappeared, and the trees all looked the same. I tried to retrace my steps, but it was no use. Panic set in. I yelled for help, but my voice just echoed back at me. As the sun started to set, I found myself back at the clearing with the fire pit. The pile of rocks was gone. It was the fall of 1997 when I found myself agreeing to watch a cabin near a small graveyard on the outskirts of a sleepy border town in Texas. The owner, an older man named Carl, had promised me a few $100 if I stayed for the weekend and kept an eye on the place. He said it wasn't much, just a simple cabin he rented out to hunters, but he wanted someone there since he was away for the weekend and didn't trust leaving it unattended. At the time, I was 24, broke, and not in a position to turn down easy money. The idea of spending a weekend alone in a cabin didn't sound too bad. I packed light, just a few clothes, snacks, and a flashlight. Carl gave me directions and handed over a key, along with a warning to lock up tight at night. He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. It was probably just to keep out animals or local kids looking for trouble. The drive out to the cabin was uneventful. The gravel road wound through scrubby desert terrain dotted with mesquite trees and cacti. The cabin itself was modest, a single-story structure made of weathered wood, with a small porch and a tin roof that looked like it had seen better days. Just behind it, maybe 50 yards away, was the graveyard. The fence around it was rusted and uneven, and the gravestones were old, some tilted or sunken into the dry ground. It looked like the kind of place where people got buried and forgotten. I parked my car and walked up to the cabin, the crunch of gravel under my boots the only sound in the stillness. Unlocking the door, I stepped inside and found a small living area with a couch, a rickety table, and a kitchenette. There was a single bedroom and a bathroom, both sparse but clean enough. A few hunting rifles hung on the wall above a wood-burning stove, and a stack of firewood sat in the corner. The first day passed quietly. I spent most of the time reading an old paperback I'd brought and occasionally stepping outside to stretch my legs. The graveyard didn't bother me much during the day. It was just a patch of dry land with weathered stones. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, the place took on a different feel. The shadows stretched long, and the air seemed heavier somehow. I locked the doors and windows, just like Carl had said, and settled in for the night. Around midnight, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a distant tapping, but it grew louder, more deliberate. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and listened. It sounded like something tapping against the window in the living room. I told myself it was probably a branch or some animal, but I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously made my way to the living room. The tapping had stopped by the time I got there, but I shone the beam of light around the room and out the window. Nothing, just darkness and the faint outline of the graveyard in the distance. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the night was silent again. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. My mind raced with thoughts of what could have caused the noise. I kept thinking about the graveyard, how old it looked, and the stories small towns always seem to have about such places. But I reminded myself there were no ghosts, no supernatural forces at work. It was just my imagination playing tricks on me. The next day, I decided to check out the graveyard up close. It wasn't like I had much else to do, and I figured it might help put my mind at ease. The gate creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the dry grass crunched under my boots as I walked between the gravestones. Most of them were so worn that the names and dates were barely legible. A few had fresh flowers placed in front of them, which struck me as odd since the place seemed so abandoned. One grave in particular caught my attention. It was newer than the others, with a shiny black headstone that stood out among the faded gray ones. The name on it was David Lopez, and the date of death was just a few years ago. There was no birth date, which I found strange, but I didn't think too much of it at the time. That night, the tapping started again, but this time it was louder and more insistent. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore it. But then came another noise, a low, scraping sound, like something being dragged across the ground. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I sat up and listened. It sounded like it was coming from the porch. I forced myself to get up and look. I grabbed the flashlight again and crept to the front door, peering out the small window. The beam of light caught something, a shadowy figure moving just beyond the porch. It wasn't an animal. It was human. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't seem to notice me, and after a moment, it disappeared into the darkness. I stayed by the window, heart racing, until the first light of dawn broke the horizon. The next morning, I checked the porch and found deep scratch marks on the wooden boards. It looked like someone or something had been clawing at it. I also noticed footprints in the dirt leading from the graveyard to the cabin. They were large, booted prints, and they stopped abruptly at the porch. It didn't make any sense. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every little noise. I thought about leaving, but I didn't want to seem like a coward. Besides, Carl was paying me to stay, and I needed the money. That night was worse. The noises started as soon as the sun went down. Tapping, scraping, footsteps, this time all around the cabin. It felt like whoever or whatever it was, they were trying to scare me, and it was working. I stayed awake all night, clutching one of the rifles from the wall, but no one tried to break in. When the sun finally came up, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my things, locked up the cabin, and drove straight back to town. I didn't even bother to call Carl. I just left the key in his mailbox and never looked back. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there. I've heard stories about people using graveyards as hiding spots for illegal activities near the border, but I've also heard stories of people going missing in that area without a trace. Whatever the truth is, I'm just glad I got out of there when I did.